One of the monks was watching the relationship video last night and liked it, so I'm going to make this for him and hopefully the rest of you guys. But I need to do a little background. When I was a young boy, Martin Luther King was demonstrating in Washington, D.C., and he was at the Lincoln Memorial. They didn't have videotape at the time, so everything was live. And I remember watching TV in the afternoon, the hot afternoon in Alexandria, Virginia, and hearing him say, you know, free at last, thank God Almighty, I'm free at last. And then mostly black and a lot of white people, but mostly black people, they would say, we have overcome, we have overcome someday. And just that I just identified with them. The black people in America, more than anything, that's what I identified with. And that's certainly why I played black music all my life. At 57, I've been playing black music for a living since I was 13. But I identified with them because I was a slave to addiction. And I didn't know why I identified with it, but that's the reason. And so that really made a difference to me. So black, civil rights, that mattered to me, and I would fight for that. But right after that happened, another rights movement, women's rights, started happening. And when that happened, just a few years later, I got behind that too, because it made good sense to me. But I made a tragic error. What I didn't understand was, I thought, okay, you need to treat women equally. And that sounded just and fair and reasonable to me. But what I did was I didn't treat them equally. I treated them the same. I treated them the same. And that was a tragic error, because women and men are different. And I didn't know that. I was trying to do what was right and treat them the same. A kind of Tocquevillian, justice. But I made a terrible error. And here's how that played out sexually in my life. If you're a grown woman and you're willing, consenting, and I make you come as hard as you make me come, there's no foul, no play, because I'm figuring you're thinking you're just like me. But women aren't like that. They're not sitting there thinking, if you make me come as hard as you come, you can fuck me. That's not what they're thinking. They're just not like that. And that's what I was thinking. And I treated women like that for decades. Till finally someone said, Steve, wait a second. All women are like that 10% of the time, and 10% of that women are like that all the time. But most women are not like that all the time. You need to hear that, because your relationships are just falling apart. And I said, what do you mean? Because I was teachable in the sense of 12-step teachability. Humility means teachability. And they said, Steve, relationships are not about making somebody come as hard as you come. That's not what it's about. What it's about is about sharing feelings. And I didn't know what that meant. And they said, well, let me show you. And the guy said, I feel sad. And I was baffled. I thought this was some left-wing, commie, San Francisco movement. And he kept talking about his sadness. He talked for 45 minutes about sadness. And I couldn't stop listening to him. So the next night, I called him again, and he started talking about his neediness. Now, I don't know about you, but I grew up military in the Presidio, and men carrying M16s around all day long. And they didn't stop their march at 12, 15 and say, I need to set my rifle down because I need to get in touch with my neediness. That's just not what men did in the 50s in the Army. They probably still don't do that. But he kept doing it. And so I started learning about feelings, and I began to have an emotional relationship with him. I began to get connected emotionally with him. And we did that for 6 months until finally one day I said, very shyly, I'm getting in touch with my sadness. And it was my first venture into emotional health. And I began to talk about my feelings. And then what happened was, later on, when it became time, when I left my first marriage and it became time, I grieved that appropriately. It became time for me to be involved with a woman. I found a woman, and the number one quality I was looking for her was emotional availability. She could share her feelings, so I could share my feelings, and we could have a healthy relationship, and then we could add commitment, and then we could add sexuality. So for me, that's what the most important thing is. And I do that with and I learned that in a platonic, heterosexual, male relationship. I learned to have a relationship, and then I transferred that to women. That's how it worked for me. There's another story. So I'm thinking, okay, we're just checking in feelings, we're cool. And I was wrong. And here's how I was wrong. There was a woman I knew, and this was 90 to 93. And she came up to me and finally revealed to me that she was in love with me. And I had no idea, because I'm dumb as a brick sometimes. I'm a pretty sensitive guy, but sometimes When somebody's a woman's into me, I just can be oblivious and just not notice. And I didn't know. So she told me. She came out and said, I said, are you in love with me? She said, yes, I am. And so she wanted to get involved. And I said, well, let me think about it. And I took, I don't know, 6 weeks to think about it. And after about 6 weeks, I said, okay, let's get involved. And so, now one thing about this woman was touring the United States with a book on polyamory. Okay? Not only was it polyamory, but 25 years ago, multiracial relationships were not as accepted as they were. So this is a multiracial, polyamorous woman who's touring the country selling her book about this. And so we were sexual. The next day, she goes to the Emory Library. Emory is like the Harvard of the South. We have the best minds, the best university in the entire South. She goes to the piles and the stacks of books in Emory and brings me 6 books, an inch and a half thick, on committed monogamy. And I learned a lesson that day. Here was a woman, professional polyamorous. And once she was sexual with somebody she cared about, she didn't care about any of that stuff. And what I learned was this, and this is what I believe. You take what you can use and leave the rest. No matter what a woman says with her mouth, no matter what she does with her body, she cannot erase millions and millions of years of history that says, some part of her brain says, I want to stay connected to you. She can't erase that. And if she does violate that, what happens is it shows up in depression, it shows up in food addiction, it shows up in self-mutilation, it shows up in obsession with men, it shows up in some kind of illness. If she defies who God has made her to be, there's no getting around it. Now, like I say, 10% of the time, all women say, fuck it, I don't care. And there are 10% of the women, and they're sex addicts, who just don't care anytime. And I've run across them, and I've hooked up with people like that. But generally speaking, my experience, and it's not totally true of anybody all the time, but to be healthy, I have to understand patterns in relationships if I'm intelligent in life. And that's what I've noticed. And so what I started to say, what I realized then is that just emotional connection was not enough. It had to be commitment. In the SLA book, in the 12th step, it says that intimacy without commitment is impossible. And I happen to agree with it. It's a fairly conservative thing as I hear it coming out of my mouth and out of my head. But in practice, that's what I find. And so my experience is if I'm sexual with a woman without commitment, I'm hurting her, even if she is okay with it. If she says it's okay, I'm hurting her. If she doesn't recognize that it's hurtful, the question is, do I hurt her knowing the truth? Or do I say, fuck, it's not my responsibility? Really? Is that using people? Is that hurting people? I believe it is, for me. So for me, what I've learned is to be healthily sexual with a woman, I need emotional availability and commitment. And with those two things, I can be wildly, freely, subtly, giddily, pornographically, gymnastically sexual in every conceivable way. Patrick Carnes says there's 2 kinds of sex. There's orange juice sex and there's cathedral sex. Cathedral sex is very meaningful. Oh, violins and a 50-piece orchestra screaming and a 100-piece choir and all that, and your oneness. And then there's just orange juice sex. You're just doing it because it just feels good and it's fun. And then actually the truth is there's gradations all between them. But for me, to do that requires 2 things. That my relationship with you as a woman is about we share feelings, so that we're friends. And then secondly, is there's commitment. For me. Take what you can use and leave the rest.